Hey everyone, this is a Barclay Damon live broadcast of the CyberSip, practical talk about cybersecurity. I'm your host, Kevin Szczepanski. Let's talk. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of CyberSip. We are pleased to be joined again by Sultan Meghji, a 30-year security and technological innovator, and for a year, he was the first Chief Innovation Officer of the FDIC. Sultan, welcome back to CyberSip.
Well, it's great to see you again, Kevin. Thanks.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for coming back. Now, in our last episode, we did not get to the reasons why you left FDIC and some of the recommendations you have for how not only that organization, but presumably others in the same position can innovate and improve. So I wanted to turn to those topics now. There comes a time when you decide that you have to move on. Can you talk to us about that? How does that happen, and how do you make that decision? I'm sure it had to be a difficult one because this to you was something of a mission.
Yeah.
What happened to make you change your mind?
Well, it was certainly a passion of mine to figure out how we could make this better for everyone. Because I do think, this, because of issues like the ones I tried to solve, the system itself is riskier. The people have more struggles. Before the camera started, we were talking about a banking fraud issue that we were just chatting about. The perfect example of how things we could do better. But it's interesting. There were a couple of things that kind of all came to a head, not too long ago. The first was, and this is probably not a surprise to anyone who knows anything about politics in the U.S. government. But oh my gosh, the politics just completely.
Really?
Yeah, completely in the way. I mean, it's, there were people who thought I was on one party and decided to treat me well or treat me poorly because of that. There were a bunch of people who thought I was in the other party and decided to either treat me well or treat me poorly because of that. And so it didn't matter if it said the sky's blue, two of those communities would agree with me and two of those communities would disagree with me. If I said the sky was purple, the other two would agree with me and the previous two would disagree with me, right? And the fight, if you will, and the, showing allegiance to the party became more important than actually getting something done. And I think, like a lot of people who come to DC kind of in a Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of way, I thought, well, I can work with this. I can figure out how to do it. And at the end of the day, there are going to be things that just you aren't able to do. And my job was to fundamentally, strategically innovate across this organization and in the sector. And the fact is, you can't do that. And in no small part because of the politics. The second thing is the bureaucracy itself. The bureaucracy is designed to support the bureaucracy and to protect the agency. And so anything you do, if it's different, it is bad. If it is anything they don't understand, it's bad. And so you end up having to spend years and years having a fight over, simple things. Even in the example I think I gave the last time I was here, I talked about putting Teams and Outlook and stuff like that on people's iPhones, right? There was a discussion, and it was actually more than one. There were a couple of discussions about if it was secure to do that. And I literally had to point out that the CIA and the US Air Force do the exact same thing. And so I figure if it's okay for the CIA, it's probably okay for a banking regulator. And then the third is that we fundamentally are in a moment where, because of the politics, because of the ignorance, because of the tech hesitancy, I looked at the list of things I wanted to accomplish. And I'd gotten about 75% of the things I wanted to get done in the first year done. And so I would call that success, And then I looked at the next year and I saw that I wasn't going to be able to get the rest of that 25% done, no matter how hard I worked or how little I worked. I could have sat on my rear end, attended meetings, turned on Teams every morning and just clicked through that while jogging, while being on an airplane, while sitting on the beach, and made as much forward progress because of the inertial process orientation of the organization as if I had been slamming my head against the wall, running around, all this. And that's when you know that the organization is just fundamentally incapable of that kind of change without far more larger strategic issues. And I think, for me, I saw a law of diminished returns there. And there are a lot of really interesting and exciting things happening out there in the market that I think are moving far faster than most people in the regulatory system realize. I think the world is changing at a much faster rate. I think 3 weeks ago, if you and I had recorded this, Kevin, before anything had happened in Ukraine, for example, we would never think land war in Europe is a likely thing to happen.
No.
Or that there is nuclear saber rattling by an autocratic dictator of a former Soviet state. I mean, this is 2022. This isn't 1986, right? And I think there's a lot of other stuff going on. So the world is changing quickly. And the great thing is since I've left, many other agencies have reached out. In fact, I'm doing basically a meeting or a call every day now with other federal agencies who also read the op-ed I put out and want to understand kind of the double click on my recommendations and see what they can do about it. Now, where it goes, how much it goes, that's fine. But, I think it's a positive sign that, there are leaders in other agencies and other parts of the US government and frankly on Congress that are looking at this as, hey, we need to take this seriously and let's see what we can do to actually, move the needle on this.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think you left in the right way. You left on a positive note, and it's been, I think we were talking off camera, it's been about 10 days.
Yeah.
And yet you gave some thought and put a serious piece out there on some of the things that you think need to happen in order to improve the situation, not only at FDIC, but as I read those recommendations, they could apply to any government institution. They could also apply to a private sector institution as well. So let's talk about some of those now. I want to run through them because I think our audience would find it helpful. You talk about civil service reform, education and training, more collaboration with companies and universities outside the Beltway. That sounds critically important. And then collaboration with international partners. Let's take the civil service reform piece first. What do you mean by that? Why is that so important?
So there are three things that I think about when it comes to people in any organization. You want to hire the best, you want to keep them, and you want to grow them, right? I don't think our civil service, at least as I experienced it, really maximized those three things. So in many situations, I was recommended to hire someone because they, were friends with someone, or they knew the right person, or they had, the people skills, but they didn't have the technical skills, over someone who had the technical skills. So it's really challenged to build a meritocracy if you're hiring for loyalty, or you're hiring for, something other than the actual skills of the job. There was a position, thankfully not one that I was hiring for, where the hiring manager called me up and she said, well, this is a technical role. Like, it was a very digitally oriented role that she was hiring for. And of the three final resumes she got, one was, and I'm not kidding, a bricklayer. And that was by the process of the civil service. That person was listed as one of the top three candidates.
Yeah.
Well,
How does it even get to that point? How does the resume even get to the desk, right?
It shouldn't, that resume should have been rejected immediately. Now, I'm sure he's a great guy, but he doesn't know the digital technologies that are needed for this role. So clearly there's a process failure there. Okay. That's on the hiring side. On the growing side, in our previous discussion, we talked a little bit about continuing education, but I do think there is, we have to make that a fundamental component of keeping people in roles. So here's a great example. Someone can sit in a job for 20 years at the FDIC, and it's not just FDIC, but others. That you can't do that, especially when we have such an older skewing, workforce. People have to move around. You have to give the people coming up the line the opportunity to grow themselves and prove themselves to land in these jobs. And if someone sits in a job for 5 years because they're waiting for their boss to retire, and then there are 20 people that are applying for that job, for one job, it's going to be a challenge. And so figuring out how to put more mobility of role and mobility of staff into the civil service is critically important. In the private sector, I'm not aware of too many people who stay in the same job for more than about 3, maybe 4 years, in large, well-established organizations, right?
A lot of mobility, sure.
Right. The mobility has to be a key component. And also growing the people and making sure they have the opportunities to grow themselves in them. And then finally, we have to keep them. So many of the really amazing young people that I had the opportunity to work with at FDIC, I created this little list of like the really high performers that I wanted to make sure were really taken care of and could really execute. And these were all people, under 40, which, most organizations would be considered young, but at the FDIC, it's absolutely considered young, who I thought were just the highest performers. They had great technical skills, great people skills, professional, they were polite, they were the best of the best. And 8 of those 10 are now no longer FDIC employees. And so that tells you that you can't retain.
Right.
And whether it's benefits packages, salary is always going to be a challenge with the government, but not as much as you think. But there are a lot of things that we do that actively discourage people from staying. For me, that is worth a serious set of examinations. If you are growing up in the 60s and 70s, having a retirement account and a pension and, health insurance, that's really it. That was exciting. That was your benefits package. Today, with cost of housing and a variety of other things going on, people in their 20s and 30s are looking for different benefits. They're looking for more flexibility. They're looking at things that make it easier for them to navigate building a family in COVID. They're looking for ways to find financial support. We all know this. Salaries have not kept up with inflation. Certainly they aren't keeping up with them now. So there's a lot of gap there. So that to me is the biggest piece of the human capital side.
You talked a second about education and training, and I know we talked about this in our past episode, but this is one of the critical reforms you've identified. I was listening, and forgive me if I get his name wrong, but I was listening to Jocko Willig, an interview. He was talking about his experience in the armed forces, and some of it seems to relate here, saying, if I have someone in my charge that's not doing the job right, whose fault is that? And the interviewer sort of sat there silently thinking, well, you're going to tell me whose fault it was. And his point was, it's my fault, right? Maybe someone isn't capable of doing the job. Maybe after doing everything you can, you discover that someone is just not able to perform and get the job done. But his point was, at least initially, that's a leader's responsibility to
Absolutely.
make sure that you have the people that are trained up and have the continuing ed they need to know how to do their job and to perform it consistently. Does that play a role in your prescription for change?
Leadership accountability is, to me, the single biggest thing I didn't see in my time in the government. I saw bad behavior, and the leaders didn't get a ding against them. The employees didn't get a ding against them. I was kind of oddly surprised at the lack of kind of human performance accountability there. It's interesting. The market has really evolved, right? People who used to take 5 days a week to do their job, basically in the last decade can do it in half the time because of enabling technologies, right? And some companies have done things with that extra 2.5 days. And they say, great, you're getting it done in that amount of time. Okay, great. We're not giving you more work. And I think if people do that, they say, okay, you do 10x per week, you get more efficient, you can do 20x per week. Okay, that's fine. That's not how good companies are solving that. What they're doing is saying, okay, great. If you can get all your work done before, by noon on Wednesday, great. Take Wednesday afternoon off. And then on Thursday, identify something else that we can make better. And then on Friday, it's all continuing education. To me, that gets you far closer to a recipe of success, to institutionalize the continuing retraining and re-education of our workforce, because it's all changing. And we have done a very poor job of it. And I think this is kind of a broader issue. We could do so much better. When you have other countries teaching advanced mathematics to children 4 or 5 years younger than we do, when you have this massive global economy engineered to be the most competitive because it's all capitalism, and we don't have the right people and the right skills and the right jobs, we have to bring them along, and we have to make it a fundamental accountability, not just of the leaders, but of the organization itself.
Yeah. So you're talking about continuing ed and training forming as much as 20%, 1 day a week, depending on circumstances. That's a critical piece. That's not happening anywhere today, is it, Sultan?
I've seen it in very few places. I've seen it in a few tech companies, but those are places where it's hyper competitive. And, if you're for example, an artificial intelligence programmer, you should be spending a day, if not 2 a week, just keeping up with the advancements in your sector. Now, I'm not aware of too many guys who are serious AI people who are making less than a couple million a year. So, they earn that money, but they
Right.
do continue to do that research. And I think technology is changing so quickly. That's kind of the order of magnitude that I'm starting to think has to become the norm, is kind of one day out of five, maybe even a little more.
Well, that's revolutionary, but given the pace of change we've talked about today and in our last episode together, it makes sense to me. Let's turn to the collaboration pieces. You talk about more collaboration with companies and educational institutions
Yeah.
outside the Beltway. And I think this is slightly off point, but I wanted to run this concept by you and maybe you can address it when you talk about this critical piece. I've heard it said by some experts that we need to move more departments of the federal government outside the Beltway because that inside perspective is too limiting, it's too provincial. We need more government organizations getting out into the land where the rest of the people are, and that may spur new ways of thinking and may decrease the amount of groupthink that affects an organization. How does that play into your sense of collaboration? And what is it that you think that private organizations and educational institutions can offer that the government is not getting today?
Yeah, it's an interesting couple of questions. So I'll jump on the groupthink comment, which I do believe is an issue, not just in government, but in a lot of larger organizations. I personally don't think geography is that big of a deal. The agency I worked for, well over half of their staff were not in DC.
Mhm.
And you still definitely had a groupthink mentality in certain issues. I think, I think we've seen through COVID that geography is less important than organizational culture. And so if you're worried about groupthink, then that's an organizational culture issue. And I don't think what building people walk into or whether they're sitting in their, home office in pajamas is really as big of a deal.
Right.
However, it is absolutely clear to me that groupthink, one of the easiest ways to solve some of that groupthink, and it fits in the continuing education discussion, is to have far more transparency amongst the federal agencies so that they are able to hear what's going on in academia and what's going on in the private sector. So over the last 30 years, we've cut so much of the funding to primary research that came out of the federal government. So I grew up in a situation where I got an NSF grant almost exactly 30 years ago
Right.
for 6 figures to study artificial intelligence. The program that paid me that and that paid for my, my bedroom and, the computers and all this stuff hasn't existed for 20 years. The closest thing that we have to that is what's happening in the private sector. So private sector, privately funded, opaque research has replaced tremendously government funded, transparent public academic research. And so if you are in the government and you are wanting to get ahead of any of these emerging technologies, even simple stuff like artificial intelligence or some of the coming changes with quantum computing or cryptocurrency or pick whatever's after that, you have to work with academia because you need to understand how the students are being trained, what the researchers are working on, even though there's a significantly smaller research base. And then you also have to be looking at what the companies are building before it comes to market. One of the challenges that so many regulatory bodies have is they're reactive when they are presented with things by a bank. Like a bank will walk into FDIC and say, oh, by the way, here's this shiny thing we built and are going to do it. Then it becomes a fire drill exercise for a year or two while the FDIC decides if they're allowed to do it. And that is a serious challenge because that really stifles innovation and it keeps the FDIC from seeing what's happening. So in a perfect world, there would be far more transparency so that organizations like the FDIC would hear about something years before they have to make a regulatory decision about it. And then they can spend lots of time pondering it and figuring it out and hiring an academic group to do some research on it or a think tank or whatever. And the fact is it's this big wall. And that wall needs to start to have more windows put in it.
Now, is that a funding issue, Sultan? Because if it is, I'm glad to hear you say that because I was going to say if it is a funding issue, we're all in trouble because
I mean,
there's such a scarcity.
I certainly don't have a subtle opinion on my thoughts about anything, getting through Congress that would make an impact here. FDIC, just for those who don't know, is not funded by Congress. It is
Right.
funded on the insurance assessments from the banking system. Actually, I had a friend who was like, "Oh my God, if there's a government shutdown, does it matter to you?" And I'm like, "Well, I think they don't get to print our paychecks because that's done by part of the government that is congressionally funded. But no, it's an independent agency." But every recommendation I've made would require no fundamental change to the budget. It would just be a way of changing what they already do. And I did that on purpose because I both while I was inside and want to make the point, this is an organization that has a multi-billion-dollar annual budget. They have plenty of money. They don't need more money. They need to deploy it in a way that actually has, I think, more of an impact.
There's simple, easy steps that don't require congressional and
Not at
presidential approval.
Not at all. It's simply a matter of having the people who are making those decisions understand what else is going on in the world and make a slightly different decision.
Let's touch on the collaboration, the international collaboration point that you make, Sultan. How does it differ from the domestic collaboration, and where are the opportunities to turn that collaboration into real results?
I mean, we could probably do an entire podcast just on this one, but I'll try to keep it a little short. But basically, there are roughly 100 different banking regulatory bodies in the United States between the states and the federal government, and they all work closely together. But in many cases, it's kind of a, write a note, wrap it around a brick, and then hurl it over the wall kind of thing. They don't work together on things. So a great example is the computer systems that all the different regulators use to actually examine the banks, where they type in the results of their examination. You would think there would be a fairly small number of these systems, right? Maybe less than 5, right? It's double digits. In fact, it's high double digits. You have agencies where they'll have multiple systems all doing the same thing. You're in a situation where there are more technology systems that manage parts of the regulatory system by like a multiple than there are actual regulatory bodies in the United States, right?
Hugely inefficient.
Massively inefficient, right? But so from a collaboration perspective, it makes it very difficult for the states and the various federal agencies to work together on things. For the first time ever last year, we got it so that we had multiple federal regulatory bodies using the same real-time collaboration tool that we set up. And that took, a tremendous amount of effort to get that across the finish line. But you would think that a banking examiner at OCC and a banking examiner at the FDIC and a banking examiner at CFPB, who all happen to be working on the same bank, could get on a chat with each other and just chat about something, like on a Microsoft Teams or a Slack or something like that. We did that for the first time last summer. And it was a pretty significant effort to get there. Now, on the international side, there's a lot that we can learn from our international partners, whether it's the European Central Bank or the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, or what the Singaporeans or the UAE or the Israelis are doing. Because of the friction and all of the different agencies and all the different actions and the legacy technology that we're dealing with here in the US, a lot of other countries have thought through things years before we would see them. And there is far less collaboration in that space than you would expect. I was very lucky to have known my opposite number at FCA when I was at FDIC before. And so the ability to look at what they did and look at what was successful and look at what wasn't, it allowed us to build the very first tech sprint for FDIC off of a blueprint that somebody else wrote, but customized to fit inside of our environment. And we did it in 90 days.
Oh, no time.
No time at all, right? And the first one was incredibly successful. We had an amazing participation. We had lots of good success. I can't wait to hear what else the FDIC does with the output of that. It's going to be hugely impactful around financial inclusion. But this is an example where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I do worry that there's a lot of, well, we didn't build it here kind of mentality, and the fact is, in this case, when we're talking about banking regulation, the U.S. is not the leader by far, and we need to close that gap pretty quickly because the bad guys are exploiting it. It's causing issues with competitiveness, and by partnering with our international friends and looking at what's happening globally, we will be able to close that gap far faster than if we were just lock a bunch of people in a room and tell them to come up with something.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right. The bad guys are not going away. But I'm reminded of a metaphor that one of my mentors years ago told me. He said, Kevin, you keep trying to hit a home run, just hit some singles. And it strikes me that the recommendations you have here are singles. They're not, you don't have to hit a grand slam to get these done. And it just sounds to me like, and the hope is that FDIC will step up to the plate and accomplish these things, implement these changes. And who knows, in a year's time or 3 years' time, the organization might be on even stronger footing than it is today.
I really hope so. I am hopeful. We'll see. We'll see. I'll come back in 6 months and tell you if I'm feeling optimistic.
I was going to ask you if you're an optimist.
Generally I am, but I'm more hopeful in this case than necessarily optimistic.
Right. All right. So, Sultan, in the time we have left, I have to ask you, what's next for you? It's only been 10 days, but I know the phone is ringing and you have been very busy. What are you working on? What do you think the next step is for you?
Well, I joked when I left that I was going to go back into retirement and sit on a beach, but that's obviously not what I'm doing. I still, I'm
Right.
still a professor. I still am a scholar at a think tank. I'm still part of Bretton Woods, but I am, in the roughly 18 months that I was kind of heads down on all of this with FDIC, the 4 or 5 years before this running a company, the couple of years at AidWork before that, it's years makes no difference, 8 years that I've been kind of heads down, and I'm taking an opportunity to step back and lift my head up and see what interesting, thoughtful, caring, smart people are doing to make the world better. And we will see. The world has changed since I've been heads down, and I need to spend some time, learning about what's cool out there. So
Yeah.
when I have something, I will. When I have something worth talking about, I'll come back to you.
Come back and talk to us anytime. I look forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed our 2 episodes and appreciate your insights. I think they're very important. And I see the connection between FDIC and the private sector. I think a lot of small and mid-sized organizations can take the advice that you have laid out for a government organization and apply it in their own worlds.
Well, I hope so. And thank you so much for having me, Kevin. And I look forward to continuing to listen to this great podcast and hear some other great people on it in the future.
You're very kind. Thank you so much, Sultan Meghji. Thank you again for joining us, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Back soon with another episode of CyberSip.
The CyberSip podcast is available on barclaydamon.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like, follow, share, and continue to listen. This material is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or a legal opinion. No attorney-client relationship has been established or implied. Thanks for listening.